Lopini, you're up. Amigo. Cool.
This is basically an expansion on the research paper that I did for our medieval philosophy course. I give a research question here on how did medieval thinkers approach Greek philosophy, which led to its transformation. I argue in this thesis that medieval theology did not merely preserve Greek philosophy, it selectively adopted, critically transformed, and theologically reoriented Greek philosophical concepts, culminating in Aquinas' synthesis of faith and reason. Medieval theology did not emerge in an intellectual vacuum. Way before the medieval periods, Greek philosophy had already developed sophisticated ideas about reality, knowledge, the soul, ethics, natural law, and metaphysics. While philosophy and theology merged closely during the medieval era, they began as separate traditions in ancient Greece, relying on different core methods like human reason and divine revelation. But before I get into those, I will begin from a key distinction, which would be a key tension in pre-Socratic philosophy, with two pre-Socratic philosophers. Heraclitus believed that reality was about this world of change. Everything was in a constant influx. Everything was changing. It was mutable. He quoted, "You can't step into the same river twice." So to Heraclitus, this was his world of change. Parmenides didn't agree with that. He thought that reality was this absolute world, and things there were basically, it was unchanging. So he's seen the world of changing to be some type of illusion. It wasn't the actual reality that we actually see. Plato comes into the picture, and he viewed the two opposite views of Heraclitus and Parmenides not to be two different, or one to be right and one to be wrong, but actually he deemed it as they were talking about two different realities. They were talking about two different realms. So he introduces his theory of forms. This is basically the blueprint, this ultimate reality. It exists independently and it possesses no conscious or active power, distinguishing between the changing physical world of appearances, senses, and the eternal intelligible world of forms or reason. From there is where we get Plato's metaphysical claim, or his metaphysical dualism, or the two-world theory. Aristotle comes into the picture and expands on Plato's concept, and he ushers in the concept of the unmoved mover. This was later used by Aquinas in his first cause argument for God. So that was the answer for infinite regress. Neoplatonism, Plotinus, is basically the godfather of that. He comes in and he ushers in the one. For Plato, he considered that the forms was the ultimate reality. Well, for Plotinus, he said that would be called the one. And his hierarchy of existence was the one, intellect, and then the soul. He ushers in also this process of what he calls necessary emanation. And Aristotle critiqued Plato's theory of forms in his book Metaphysics. And he talks in there about how there seemed to be a gap in between what Plato was explaining in his theory, or his understanding of his hierarchy existence. He felt like that Plato's is a demiurge and receptacle appeared metaphorical rather than mechanically clear. So it gives us a question: how does a non-material form produce a changing material object? The third slide here that I'm talking about is the beginning of transformation. Greek philosophy described the divine as an impersonal first principle. Plotinus, for one, taught necessary emanation from the one. Aristotle, the unmoved mover, was pure intellect contemplating itself. Augustine and Aquinas rejected necessary emanation. They argue that God freely created the world, creatio ex nihilo, basically out of nothing. The contrast or the opposite argument to that would be creatio ex materia, meaning God created from pre existing material. Medieval theology transformed Greek philosophy by presenting God not as an impersonal being, but as personal, loving, active in history, and involved in salvation. Augustine's transformation. Augustine adopted Neoplatonic concepts, but reinterpreted them through Christian theology. He replaced the hierarchy of Plotinus, which is the one, the intellect, the nous, or soul, or psyche, with the equal persons of the Trinity. He moved the divine names, or the divine ideas, forms or archetypes within the intellect, which is a secondary divine realm or second hypostasis, similar to the Logos or Christ in Christianity, into the mind of God alone. So for Plato, he used the form or the intellect was this secondary divine realm, and that's where the ideas or divine ideas existed. But for Aquinas, and Augustine, they believe that was in God's mind alone. He accepted evil as a privation of good, while rejecting the belief that matter itself is evil. So Augustine understood that this privation of good was that evil was, for the question of the problem of evil, that evil was not a separate entity, but it was more so a separation from God. He located the origin of evil in the misuse of free will rather than in matter. He used the inward journey of the soul, but concluded that salvation ultimately depended on God's grace. Aquinas demonstrates that medieval religious concepts were both philosophical and theological. He adopted Aristotle's unmoved mover, his formal logic and deductive reasoning, four causes, material, formal, efficient, and final. Natural law, the universal moral order that applies to all people everywhere, connect human reason with God's divine plan, and his confidence in human reason. At the same time, he transformed these concepts by teaching creation out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo, God is pure being. In the Latin, ipsum esse subsistens, meaning subsisting on its own, that God is existence itself, or quiddity, his whatness or essence. What he is identical with his act of existence, esse, that he is. This right here is not applied to the created being, according to Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. This is only could be applied to God himself. God is the ultimate final cause, is the basic of his teleology. Faith and reason are complementary because both originate from God. My argument is that medieval theology, they borrowed Greek logic, metaphysics, ethics, and rational inquiry. They modified ideas such as participation, being, and virtue. They rejected necessary emanation, the impersonal first principle, and the eternity of the universe. They reconstructed these ideas within the biblical framework, centered on creation, revelation, grace, and salvation. I conclude that Greek philosophy provided the conceptual tools. Medieval Christianity transformed those tools into a theological worldview. Augustine began the process by reshaping Neoplatonism through Christian doctrine. Aquinas completed the synthesis by integrating Aristotelian philosophy, reason, with Christian theology, faith. My conclusion is that medieval philosophy should be understood not as the preservation of Greek philosophy, but as its creative transformation through Christian theology. And that's the end of my presentation.